it's fun to come over, for me, to come to like a different part of the world and see how people think and how do you integrate food and what do you consider problems and what do you consider beneficial. And so, but what I'm going to do before I get into things is I want to start with my story, our story, my daughter and I's story. We are co-founders of our company, Grain Free Mamas. But what happened was my daughter will turn 21 on May 21st. And when she was 6 years old, so that was in 2004, one night after dinner, she just bends over and starts screaming at the top of her lungs. And we thought her appendix had burst. And so we went to the doctor, to the emergency room, and they ran all these tests, and they had put the IV in her, and they're running everything. Everything comes back negative. And then they politely offered to take her appendix, and I was like, no, we'll keep it. We want all of her body parts. So we left there, and then the subsequent days of testing, $5,000 poorer with 0 answers. So I'm actually a scientist, and because of that, because of my background, I don't want a pharmaceutical to fix something unless I know there's no underlying damage being done. And so our search for why, before we were going to put her on any kind of medicine to take care of what we did not know, we needed to find out why. And so we went to this doctor in Florida. Found a great doctor there that was a conventional and naturally trained doctor. Took him 5 minutes, and then he sat down, gave me the sentence that would change my life. He said, well, Mrs. Traxler, when your daughter eats wheat and sugar, it makes a toxic little punch in her stomach, and it's burning little holes in her intestines. And I sat back and went, that certainly explains the screaming. And so we went home. We went out of the office there, and we are newly gluten-free now. So we go to the store. We went to Whole Foods. That was the one that was available back then that we knew of. And we walked down the aisle. I'm holding her hand, and as we're walking, all I can think in my head is, can't eat that, 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 can't eat that. And we get through the store. We had picked up a couple of gluten-free items. We tasted them, and they were awful. And so I get out, and I'm standing there looking at my little daughter, and her chin is quivering because she's been given a life sentence as far as she knows. And I looked at her, and we made a pinky promise. I said, baby, your mama is a scientist. And I said, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and someday we will provide the help that we wish would have been available for us. And so 16 years have gone into the research, and I've studied countries and cultures and civilizations and incidents of disease and ingredients and things that cause inflammation in the body, things that promote health in the body. And what I found was, as I was doing this research, the foods that were labeled as gluten-free were pretty weird. And when we went to invite somebody over, or we went to get a product off a shelf, we'd have to Google the ingredients that we were supposed to be adding, and then we'd end up with a big bag of something weird that, what am I going to do with after I put it away? And so gluten-free began to have a really bad name and a really bad taste sensation as well. And at that point in time, I decided that wasn't good enough for me. One, I was not going to willingly accept that my children had to go through their lives and be envious of everybody else's food. And number two, I refused to accept that my children had to just develop more and more autoimmune diseases before they died, because I had 2 older boys too, and they started to show symptoms. So we started with gluten-free, but gluten-free wasn't good enough. They were still sick, and they would do things, and you could call it cross-contamination, but I went, no, that doesn't make sense. That makes no common sense. And so we went grain-free. And grain-free worked a little bit better, but still there were some problems. And then my son got sicker, thought he was having an ulcer, or my oldest son. I took him in, found out corn and sugar were his problem. The middle son, wheat, sugar, and soy. And so now I had a broader base. And then what happened was, ultimately I went, oh my gosh, we cannot digest the grasses genus, all of those things. So not just wheat and gliadin. Gliadin is the prolamine or protein that's found in barley, wheat, and rye. And when the testing was done in the 50s, the American diet was largely composed of those 3 grains. But oat, millet, spelt, triticale, sorghum, corn, rice, and sugarcane. Did you know they're all in the same family? They're in the grasses genus. They're in the grasses genus. And if you think about grazing animals eat grasses. And they have different stomachs than humans do. So they have to keep eating to be able to ruminate their food and digest it properly. Well, we don't ruminate our food unless we're sick. And so I started making this connection. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. You know, the gluten-free foods that are out there, the products that are out there, if you pick them up, the ingredient label is this long. It's teeny tiny print. And it's filled with rice and corn and all these other grasses family members. Okay, and every member of the grasses genus is comprised of prolamines and glutamines. And they're almost bioidentical to gliadin, but why do we only associate gliadin with the problem? And you know, there's differing opinions on this, but what we found in 16 years of my children who are healthy now, we carried the gene in my family for gluten sensitivity and the gene for celiac. And yet my children are now 23, 25, and my daughter soon to be 21, and nobody has developed celiac. Nobody has developed these diseases because I changed their diet radically. And so I started experimenting with things. Nut flours. Nut flours are great, but there's a lot of people that have an allergy to nuts, and I believe it is the nuts, but also the molds. You know, and in my family, my children and I were all allergic to grasses, weeds, trees, and nuts. And you have that, the gluten, and really if you think about it too, you know how many people do you know that have like hay fever or seasonal allergies? Seasonal allergies are grasses, the grasses family. So if you cannot breathe them, it would only make sense that you probably cannot digest them as well. So common sense, but nut flours can be very helpful. We started out with almond flour. Has a great texture, but to keep that molder, you have to have really good sources for it. Coconut flour and tapioca or cassava root flour, very good, and they work in combination with each other. And those are very beneficial. Coconut is a vegetable, even though it's considered a nut in America by the FDA, it's actually a vegetable. And then you have garbanzo bean or chickpea flour. And the cassava, coconut, nut flours, those things have been used around the world. It's not only grasses and the grasses family that have been used to make like baked products in the history of mankind. But then also I started working now more with green banana flour and plantain flour because of the high resistant starch. And the resistant starches, you know, most people, I guess a lot of people do know this, but you know, they're called resistant starch because the enzymes in the human stomach cannot digest them, and so they get passed through in the intestines, and the bacteria digest them, produce a byproduct called butyrate, and butyrate, once it enters the colon, is actually food for the cells in the colon wall. And then you have arrowroot and tiger nut flour. Tiger nut flour is taken on more, kind of a little bit greater benefit in the United States, and it's getting more popular. Then malanga flour is another one, it's a root. Now coffee flour, I put it on there, but coffee is the most heavily pesticided, you know, and sprayed crop in the world, and so that is a concern. I believe in organic because I think that less is better. And yes, there can be some organic spraying methods that aren't as healthy, but overall organic is, I think, a lot better and natural for the body. And then beetroot flour is another one, but it's very red, and when you digest it, everything comes out very red. So you might want to tell your consumers that there's a possibility it could be real red coming out. What about sweeteners? Stevia, monk fruit, coconut sugar, date sugar and date honey, maple syrup and honey. These are all naturally occurring things, but the stevia now is a little bit concerning to me because we're seeing it being added with, acacia fiber. And acacia fiber, if you already have and xylitol, if you have a compromised gut, they're very hard to digest, so you may not be helping people. You know, pure stevia, the extract, people seem to digest it well, at least what I've seen too, and especially the green powder, and the leaves taste fabulous. I'd buy a plant, the next day I'd wake up, my children would have eaten it, and it looked like a little stick. So, and what about dairy? Dairy can be good for some people, good for others. I've heard a lot of stuff during the time that I've been here too, which is so unique, and I love it because so many great cows and cheeses and everything here in Switzerland. But there are people that have problems with it. And if you think about it too, let's take the common sense approach. If the cows don't keep feeding it to their children, maybe we shouldn't keep drinking it as well. And I think there's raw cheeses and stuff that can be digested well, but there's a lot of people that struggle with it. And so, but there's ways to make products that don't have that in there, and then let people decide for themselves if they want to put cheese on it or not. And so you have your nut milks, coconut milk, hemp milk, and banana milk. Banana milk is a little bit thicker. Hemp milk is thinner, and again, you have the plus and minus. There isn't a lot of nutritional value in the hemp flour and hemp milk once you pull everything out of it, but I also think it's fairly neutral too. So you do have that. You can use avocado and coconut oil as a butter. Okay, so you can replace things there. There's alternative cheeses. Now, sheep cheese and goat cheese, I think, have been pretty popular in Europe for a long, long time. They're gaining popularity in America. And then you have alternative cheeses, and that really depends on, what foods you digest better. I don't think there's one size fits all for anyone. I really don't. I think everybody's body is unique and different. And when we formulate products, we need to have a variety of products to fit the consumer's need. So now you have a lot of free from, and here's just a little chart that talks about, they do estimate 10 to 15% worldwide. I know that in my everyday conversations with people, I think that number might be a little higher. I think there's a lot of people that have trouble with allergy, food things. You can call it a trend, but really, is it a trend if people are getting sicker all the time? The rise of autoimmune is alarming. Not just, and you can't even make it. It's worldwide. That in Africa, they expect free from products to explode. That is probably the greatest growth that they're expecting now. And it's just, I guess I say free from more accurately describes that consumers moving away from consuming inflammation-inducing foods. We see a lot of people that are really thin now and really big. And it used to be, when I was a kid, you saw somebody with a really big belly and really skinny legs, that meant they were malnourished. But we've taken that definition out of our everyday language now. Real food for real people. Sometimes I think that we eat like we're living on Mars, and we don't have access to farms and real foods. And even thinking about the first astronauts that went, they came back and they were like, oh, look at them, they're puffy, and I think that it was the atmosphere that caused all that. Well, maybe it wasn't the atmosphere. Maybe it was the little pre-made everything and not fresh anything that they got sent up to the moon with. So, and then I think it's easy for us to get in such a frenzy for the next torn apart ingredient that we lose sight of real food for real people. Have we really gotten to the point where we don't have enough ingredients worldwide to give people real food in the way that we need to take it apart and then put it back together again and then use all these different additives to make it look like real food again? Isn't that hard for the body? Here's one that I think is very interesting. So, and I think it's over here too, but grain-free food is the hugest trend for your pets. Grain-free. Grain-free food. Why is grain-free food so big for the pets? And because the pets were getting so big. And then they were like, well, cut down on the grains because we don't want the pets to get so big. But I think that, you know, I think that more than, even though you hear it said that obesity is the hugest problem, I think that it's inflammation. I don't think there's as many obese people in the world as there are critically, chronically inflamed people all over the world. And we can give people all different kinds of things, but if we don't go to a focus back to ingredient-based foods, whole ingredient-based foods, are we just gonna see new autoimmune rise up? You know, real food for real people. So this is what the consumer wants, and I've heard this, not just me, I've heard this in every session I've attended so far. Truth in labeling. Truth in labeling. Recognizable ingredients. You know, do you really have to have a science degree to know what you're eating? Okay? Certification symbols. Why are certification symbols on the rise? Because the consumer doesn't believe what they're eating. They don't believe the claims, so they want a third party to verify. Okay? Traditional tasting and textured products. You know, one of the things that we really don't want to do, the problem that the gluten-free industry has had that's given it a bad name is because a lot of the foods taste horrid. Not even just bad, but you know, real food tastes fabulous, and you can try different ingredients. Get your mind out of the box and start to think about putting together real foods. You know, it's kind of like if you have a daycare and you put all the kids out in the playground and you watch and you can find out, well, which kids play better together? Which ones don't like each other? We've got to keep them away from each other. You know, you can do the same thing with these innovative ingredients, and we can come up with a bunch of fabulous tasting foods that can reduce inflammation, reduce incidence of disease, and help us to live in a more sustainable world. We don't just have to protect the earth, we have to protect ourselves in the earth. So, and they want ease of preparation because our busy lifestyle is not going to stop just because we decided to be healthier. So we need to make them as easy to prepare and use as few of artificial ingredients, flavors, and colorings as possible. Look at nature for things that will preserve in its entirety. Look in nature for things that will color in its entirety. Beet, you know, if you want something red, use a little beet flour. And to understand the new consumer, you know, our customer profiles, there's all these different diets are big, and ketogenic I don't think is really as big over here. In America, in the United States of America, it is huge. But if you look at all these diets, gluten-free, grain-free, sugar-free, dairy-free or lactose intolerant, soy-free, corn-free, vegetarian and vegan, paleogenic, and ketogenic. The ketogenic diet was developed in the 30s and 40s to treat schizophrenia. So the gut-to-head mechanism is real, and there have been people that have known about this for a long, long time, about 80 years. And soy-free is one, but you look at the rest of these, and a lot of these are proteins. You know, the proteins in the grains are what my family cannot digest, simply cannot digest. You know, but if you look, some people, their bodies don't digest animal protein better, but maybe they digest, you know, plant protein better. So there's a balance in everything. And why is it that our bodies are not digesting protein so well anymore? You know, what's changing? Is it all the chemicals? Is it in the environment? Or is it what we're eating? Plus then that makes it easier for the environmental chemicals to bother us as well. You know, let's take as good a care of ourselves as we do of our planet. Now that we're wanting to be sustainable, let's make ourselves sustainable too. So for autoimmune affected consumers, the biggest problem is really finding safe products that taste good, that have good taste and texture. And so that's really, really important. And if you look, the gluten-free and grain-free products are filled with the other members of the grasses family. People that have to eat gluten-free, or people that choose to eat gluten-free, if they're just filling themselves with almost bioidentical prolamines, aren't they going to have trouble over time? And that's what happened to myself and my children, is that we found it was a big connection. If you look in the research, the grasses family, and you know, you hear the big trend for sugar, reduce this, you know, corn sugar is bad, and it's well known. All those food products within that one big family are very well known and well documented and well researched to cause inflammation in the human body. And so what I just want you to think about is this, you know, I say this loosely, but we're involved in producing the foods that help people to feel great. Not just other people, but ourselves. Let's put our heads together and let's produce foods that are fabulous tasting. You know, the health conscious consumers want plant-based products with well-known taste and texture. You know, there's a lot of products that go out there that maybe you do not feel the way I do, but there's some really weird stuff that you can find. Okay, let's try and make normal food for normal people. Low calorie and low carb. Why do we want that? Because we have so much inflammation in our bodies. We have to reduce the inflammation in our bodies, or our bodies will develop the autoimmune diseases that we have the genetic predispositions for. And you see that in the testing now, in individualized nutrition and all that. It all goes back to getting inflammation out of the body. So a short ingredients list, again, ease of preparation, and good nutrition panel ratios. The health conscious consumer is becoming more and more knowledgeable. And Google does not know everything, but it knows a lot. So the consumers can know. They can know and they want to know. So at the very end, this is what I want to say to you, and then I'll open it up for questions. But with the products that we're making and we're putting out there, is less sick good enough? Is less sick good enough for you? Is less sick good enough for me? It was not good enough for me. It wasn't good enough for my children. You know, I was a mom who was a scientist who was fighting for her children's lives. I wasn't going to accept that my kids were going to be sick. If your kids had to cross a freeway every day and the chances of them dying were huge, would you not build a bridge to the other side? Or put in a light, or have a walkway, or build a tunnel? You know, we would. And yet, in the food category, we seem to take on the notion that less sick is acceptable, that less tasty is acceptable, and that less flavorful is acceptable. Life is meant to be enjoyed to the fullest. And I know for me, I'm going to do everything I can to make that possible, not just for myself, but for my children and for all the consumers that I can get my product into the hands of. So thank you so much for having me.